So let's go ahead and begin. So obviously we're going to be talking about the gospel and the stars, more specifically the Bethlehem star. But before we begin, I want to address, we're here to learn more about how God uses the stars to communicate to us. So first, this is going to be more about the Bible itself and astronomy second. But I do want to address there is going to be a lot of science in this that points back to the Bible. So there's going to be a lot of verses and a lot of science, but I'll do my best to simplify all the science side of things so that it's easy to understand. With that, I also invite everyone to kind of set aside any past thoughts or preconceived ideas for the moment about any kind of astronomy versus like astrology, which I'll address astrology itself too. Make sure that we're staying within the parameters of the Bible here. And then, of course, if you have any questions, feel free to post them down in the chat. Denise is going to be monitoring the chat for questions. If I'm going to be addressing it later, she will let you know of that. Otherwise, we'll compile them so that I can then address them all at the same time, or she'll stop me if it's pertinent for understanding the rest of the presentation here. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Most of you already know me. I am Dylan Archer, Denise's son. I'm 29 years old. I love astronomy. I love technology itself. And I've studied astronomy for so long. Since 2011, I've taken two years worth of astronomy, both in high school and in college. I even went and was invited to NASA to an aerospace academy where we got to see how the scientists created the devices that went up into space to Mars and etc. So it's very interesting details getting to join NASA there. And that's actually where I got this shirt from. But something else I wanted to point out was my favorite verse right now is Proverbs 25, verse 2. And I think it's very appropriate for this presentation today because it says, it's the glory of God to conceal a matter, but it's also the glory of a king to search out this matter. And I went ahead and added the third verse as well because the third verse is also appropriate. It says, as the heavens are high and the earth is deep, so are the hearts of kings. And how they're unsearchable, meaning I take that as God is so deep in his knowledge and everything that we could search every minute of our life and still not fully understand who he is and how great he is. But with that, I wanted to show you a couple of my own astronomy photos that I've taken over the years. Most definitely my most favorite object to photograph is the moon. Because of the details, the color, the change, and I know you're like, what color? But you know, these dark areas, and what astronomers, both past and present, how they define them, and how they choose to study it, as well as taking photos of, planets. So here we have Jupiter. And if you see these three dots, I don't know if they're going to be visible. They are actually Jupiter's major moons. They're also known as Galilean moons because Galileo actually discovered them. In addition to Jupiter, I also took a photo of Saturn. Though it's a little grainy, it's still one of my most prized photos. I did take this with my telescope and digital camera back in March of 2017. Here's some more photos of the moon and the details of the craters and the oceans, or mares as they call them. But a more recent fascination that I've had is actually of blood moons. And these are actually lunar eclipses where they go perfectly into the shadow of the Earth. And the only light that's able to go around the Earth through the atmosphere and actually hit the moon is red light. And NASA's actually deemed them blood moons. So very interesting there. And even in the Bible, they refer to them as blood red moons as well. So very interesting that even NASA recognizes them as the term blood moon. So with that, I also want to share my favorite verse by one of my favorite scientists. It is Albert Einstein's quote, "Science without religion is lame, and religion without science is blind." Now, the reason why I like this quote is because I truly believe that science was developed out of an all for God, to learn more about him, regardless of what the world says about science and God. And I do believe he was a Christian, and he actually searched out a lot of scientific things, as well as Sir Isaac Newton, about the Bible and astronomical events too. So with all that, let's go ahead and pray. Let's make sure that we're all have open hearts to learn everything that we have today. So, Father God, I thank you for this time. I thank you for everything that you do for us, both known and unknown, especially the unknown things. You're such a merciful and patient God, and I thank you for that. I thank you for sharing yourself deeper and in more areas as time goes on. I ask that you help our eyes stay open and our hearts stay open so that the word can pour into us and resound in us. And anything that is not of you, let it fall away, not to distract us or trouble us any further. I ask all these things in Jesus' precious name. Amen. All right. So, obviously, most of y'all already know today we're going to be talking about the Bethlehem Star. I'm excited to share what I've learned about this, but I do need to clarify a few things so that we're not misunderstanding here. This information has been discovered for years and even centuries before I was even alive. So, none of this information is mine, my own, but I have accumulated this information through many different sources, including Rick Larson's documentary, The Bethlehem Star, with other sources as well. So what I've done is I've just compiled a lot of the information that I've learned through all these sources into this presentation to kind of make it a little bit easier to see the science behind the Bethlehem Star and just build our faith more. So after doing my own research, these are kind of the things that I've come up to together. So with that said, the Bible and the stars, we're here to discover what God is saying through the stars and that he has created for us. We're going to use modern science, using computers, to use astronomy to look back in time to see how these astronomical bodies did their beautiful dance to signify the coming of Jesus. So we're going to start at Genesis chapter 1. And it says, "And God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be lights in the expanses of the heavens to give light upon the earth. And it was so. And God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning the fourth day." So a lot of this we already know. We know that God created the sun, the moon, and the stars. We also know that the sun is the greater light that rules the day. The moon and the stars are the lesser light that rules the night. We also see that he created them for signs and for seasons, for days and years. Also know this, sun goes down, sun comes up. It's a new day. We go around the sun 365 days. That's a new year. We also know seasons change 3 times, 4 times in the year. We got spring, summer, fall, winter. But the other thing that I wanted to point out, though we're not going to cover it in this presentation, maybe in a different one, but this is kind of how I get curious and start going into this kind of stuff, and it becomes a hobby to me. I find it fascinating that he created the sun, moon, and stars on the fourth day. So that means there were 3 days, day 1, 2, and 3, without a sun, moon, or stars, but he was still creating them. So very fascinating details to kind of think through, but that's also kind of like a sneak peek of how I do my scientific biblical studies into especially the stars. So now I know I'm talking about signs in the sky, and some people might be thinking, wait a minute, is this astrology? I want to address that first and foremost. This is not astrology, this is astronomy. Very similar words, but astronomy is the science behind the stars, the planets, and other objects in outer space and their movements. No power in those other than the power that God gave them to be set into motion. But astrology is the thought of how the position of the stars and the movements of the planets have a supposed influence on events in people's lives and the behaviors of what people do. Now, I'm speculating, I can only wonder, maybe that's why astrologers came about. They saw the signs and then happened to correlate them to life events. And they're like, wait a minute, maybe the star, I don't know. I can only speculate based off that. I'm not an anthropologist, none of that. So, but another interesting verse that talks about astrology in the Bible is Isaiah 47, basically saying if you follow star worshipers and astrologers, there's absolutely no power in them. They wander about aimlessly on their own, and not even them can save you. So just kind of wanted to address that. And again, just a reminder, we know that the enemy is here to steal things, kill, and destroy. His only goal is to populate hell with God's favorite people, which is you and me. And how he does that, he does by stealing things, killing things, destroying. That's what I believe he's done with the stars. The stars were obviously created by God first for their original intent. And over the years, Satan, through humans, have altered that to make it a more worshiping thing, taking power away from God and putting it into something else that really doesn't have power. So, and with that, we know that God comes back to give us life and give it abundantly to its fullest. So with that, let's go ahead and dive into a little bit more biblical verses going on here. We know that Psalms 19 is probably one of the most popular and most quoted astronomy verse, where it talks about the heavens declare the glory of God and the skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day, they pour forth speech. Night after night, they reveal knowledge. Interesting how it says they pour forth speech. And as it goes on, it keeps talking about how they have a voice and it goes out to the whole world, but there's no words to it. And then, of course, that the heavens, they each have their own tabernacle or a tent that the sun goes into. This will go more into the Mazzaroth, which are the 12 major signs that the world knows as zodiacs. The Mazzaroth is actually first mentioned in the book of Job, one of the oldest books in the Bible. But that's actually a presentation that I'm planning to do later in 2023 that we can get scheduled out as people are interested and want to join in that. But moving on to actually the book of Job, he talks more about other astronomical objects. We have the chains of Pleiades, which is actually a star formation in Taurus. We have the cords of Orion. Orion is the most popular constellation there is because everybody can point out those 3 stars that make up his belt. And even lead forth the constellations and its seasons, kind of talking about pitching a tent for the sun and the constellations, and guide the stars of the bear with her sons. There are actually 2 bears in the sky, in the northern sky. There's Ursa Major and Minor. An interesting fact, one of their tails is actually the northern star. So the bear is always, rotating around. So I thought that was very interesting there. And then one more thing I want to point out is Isaiah and Psalms, how they point out that God knows each one of these stars by their names. He knows how many there are and that none of them are out of place. So it's very interesting that even, God knows exactly their names, how many there are, and of course, where they're supposed to be at all times. So some very fun and interesting details. So with all that as a good foundation, our goal here is we're going to observe another way in which God speaks to us, not turn to a created tool to worship. We know that God speaks to us in many different forms. We know he speaks to us in like dreams and visions as another example. So, but before we hop in, I want to go ahead and ask if anybody has any questions, feel free to put them down into the chat of the Zoom. I'd love to address those as we're going, just to make sure that I'm covering everybody's bases and I don't skip over anything or glaze over anything. Like I said, I'll do my best to cover them as we go, but otherwise I'll take questions at the end. But one thing I wanted to point out was, as a kid, the Bethlehem star, to me, I had tons of questions. At first, I was just like, cool, it's a star. It's God. Of course he can do that. But then as I grew up and I started learning more and more about science, I was like, wait a minute. Stars don't stop. They don't do these things that the Bible talks about them. And so that's kind of what set in motion this discovery and this learning about the Bethlehem star specifically. Now, like I said, a lot of this is molded after Rick Larson's documentary, The Bethlehem Star, which I'll share with you at the end, that you can go either watch or buy or whatever you prefer. But I did also mix in a lot of my own studies and knowledge from other individuals into this too. But some of the most popular questions around the Bethlehem Star, are, why was this star the most significant than others? And was it really on December 25th? And if it wasn't, then why do we celebrate Christmas then? And then, of course, if this was a star, at Jesus's birth, were there any other signs during other times in Jesus's life? Maybe whenever he was crucified, maybe whenever he did his first miracles, so it's some very interesting questions around specifically, now that we know that the sun, moon, and stars are there to mark specific times and seasons and events. So with that, let's go ahead and actually dive into the beginning of where Jesus has started and why this Bethlehem star comes about. So in Genesis, we know he's first mentioned because of the fall of man. We see God talking to the serpent and the woman, talking about how he's going to create separation, but there will be someone who will come along and will bruise his head and that the enemy will have hardly any power against him. We also know in Isaiah on how he's going to come through a virgin that will conceive and give birth, and his name will be Emmanuel. In Daniel, we can also see who he is and some of his power here. The Son of Man was coming. And then in Luke, it tells where he was born and of whose descendants he will originate from. So we can see he's going to come from Bethlehem, of the house and of the family of David. That's going to be important later. And in Numbers, it tells us what will tell us when he has come. So it's going to be a star shall come forth. So some interesting Bible verses that are going to, keep building towards what we are getting at here with the Bethlehem star. So with these verses, we have our who, our what, our why, and our where, and our how, but we just don't know a when. The timing of all this is what's the confusing part. We don't know specifically a time. I do also like to kind of throw in here, the world has actually switched calendars since then, and through different calendars. There was the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar. There's even a scientific calendar called a sidereal calendar. So I'm certain there's a little bit of confusion between the transitions of calendars and dates that could also lead to a little bit of this too. But looking into the Bible, I think we can find a very pinpointed location in which the birth of Jesus was. So let's go ahead and start, and let's go to the coronation. Let's go when Gabriel approaches Mary. Now, we know this is the when, but how can we find how this lines up with our calendar and timing? And can we use modern science like astronomy to figure that out? So let's go ahead and go to Luke chapter 1, verses 28 through 33. And we see Gabriel, he's talking to Mary. He says, "Greetings, favored one, the Lord is with you." The angel said to her, "Don't be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God. And behold, you will conceive in your womb and give birth to a son, and you shall name him Jesus." So surely the biggest pivotal events in history around, Jesus is coming. Don't you think something like that would be in the stars if we know that the sun, moon, and stars are signifying event? So here's our why again and our how again that we saw in Genesis and Isaiah. But let's go ahead and go to Matthew chapter 2 and get a little bit more details about how we can figure out more about the star. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive into Matthew chapter 2. So we see, now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he that is born, King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and are coming to worship him." So we know these are the magi, but I want to pull out these details here. It was in the day of Herod, the king. That's important because that's also going to help us figure out our when. And I'll bring those details in here in a second, but let's just go ahead and pull that out as evidence for us. And of course, we're also going to pull out the star rose in the east. The reason why that's important is because if you think about stars in the north and the south, like we were talking about the pole star Polaris, it doesn't rise in the east, it actually rises in the north. And in fact, in the northern hemisphere, it never sets. It's always rotating. You could technically always see it, but because the sun comes out, we can't see it because the sky's illuminated. So interesting that the star is from the east specifically. And so it couldn't be from the north or the south. And so let's go ahead and move on to verses 3 and 4. When Herod the king had heard these things, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he demanded of them where Christ should be born. Now, it's very interesting that even Herod himself and Jerusalem were troubled by the coming of the Magi, speaking of a king that would be born. Now, why would that be something troubling, and why is it important to this story? Well, because the Middle East is a hot place. We know that, in the summer, it can be a very hot and desert-ish place, and it wasn't uncommon for people to sleep on their roofs. Well, whenever you sleep on the roof, you're looking up, you're seeing the stars, you're seeing all the activity in the night sky. So that tells us it wasn't an immediately obvious object like a comet or an asteroid or like a supernova of a star exploding or turning into a different form of a star. And then the other thing that was interesting is Herod had to ask where Jesus would be born. He hadn't known. He wasn't aware of any sign or prophecy whatsoever. So Using this information about Herod, we know that we can figure out when Herod was around because of Matthew chapter 2, where he talks about when he was tricked by the magi, he became very angry and he had all the boys that were 2 years old or younger killed. And it's very unlikely that a genocide like this wouldn't be recorded in history. And we know it is because we can look at the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus. He was alive, and these dates are debated, but it's still roughly averaged 37 AD to about 100 AD. And the reason why this is important is because he wrote a book, a manuscript, titled The Iniquities of the Jews, writing about wars and events specifically around the Jews. Now, he has had manuscripts circled the globe to all the famous libraries, and especially this one. But the interesting thing is that any manuscript printed after 1544 dates Herod's death at 4 BC. And another interesting fact, although I'm not going to cover it in this one, again, kind of revealing a little bit of how I do a little bit of the science research stuff. I did actually figure out in this manuscript, Josephus mentions that Herod died after a lunar eclipse, but before a Passover. So it's one of those things that I'm like, ooh, I got to pull that out and I got to research that. And let me figure out a little bit more, science behind that and figure out specifically. But we can actually cross-reference this information to some very famous and well-known manuscripts in the secular world from the Chinese manuscripts. These are actually referenced quite a bit, especially in astronomy, because the Chinese were very good about making sure that they recorded anything that ever happened in the night sky. But in the year 4 BC, there was nothing recorded or anything around that, around that in the years prior. So in 5 BC and 6 BC. So something else that was interesting was if you find a manuscript from Josephus in the years that were printed before 1544, it actually shows Herod's death at 1 BC. Now, how those years got switched up, I'm not certain, but it is a very interesting fact given what we're about to look at more here in a second. So with that information, we're going to stick between the years 1 BC and 3 BC. And we're going to use God's calendar to kind of see where those will be. So let's hop back into Matthew chapter 2, learn just a little bit more before we hop into some visuals through software. So we got Matthew chapter 2, verses 5 and 6. And they said unto him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what the prophet Micah says. And you Bethlehem in the land of Judah are not the least among the princes of Judah, for out of you shall come a governor that shall rule my people Israel. So obviously this is another thing that troubled Herod. He was afraid to lose his kingship. But the interesting things that we need to pull out of this, which we're all very aware of, is that he was born in Bethlehem and that he was going to be a great ruler. So moving forward, we got verses 7 and 8. Then Herod, when he had privately called the wise men, inquired of them diligently what time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search diligently for the young child. And when you have found him, bring me word again that I may come and worship him. Well, we know that wasn't exactly true. But some interesting details that we need to know here is, again, Herod had to inquire when, because he had no idea. And notice that this word says appeared in past tense. That means that there was more than one sign, because in the very next verse, in Matthew chapter 2, verse 9, it says, the star which they saw in the east went before them, again, after they had talked to Herod, and then it stopped over where the child was. So we know that there was more than one sign. The first one appeared that led them to Herod, and then the second one that appeared that led them south to Bethlehem. And then the fact that the star stopped. So let's just go over these one more time. We know the star rose from the east and it set in the west. We know that Herod and Jerusalem didn't know much about it because it was a subtle event, but it was also significant that even the Magi found it. Herod had to ask where Christ would be born. We know that it's from Bethlehem and that he would be a great ruler, and that there were more than one signs. One that led the Magi to Jerusalem, and then a second one that led them from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, which is just 5 miles south of Jerusalem. So very interesting detail there. And that the star stopped over where Jesus was. So we're going to hop into some software. I am using a software called Sky Safari. It does a lot of sciencey stuff. Don't worry too much about the screen, what you see on your screen right near here, other than the fact that you can see things, they're rising from the east and they're setting in the west. You see planets, you see stars, you can even see the moon here somewhere. And zenith just represents the point exactly over your head. But you don't get too caught up on that scientific definition stuff. I'll cover anything that's important here. The software, unfortunately, is a paid software, but I'll suggest some apps if anybody is interested in kind of doing their own research of what I've said. But here we see, like I said, those objects are rising from the east and setting in the west. So moving forward, we do have this problem. There is a star that stops, and that's kind of random. Stars don't stop. Like we saw in that previous screen, they all rose from the east and set in the west. And we also know that it appeared twice, like no other night before, that set the Magi out on this journey. So we have our when mixed with Herod. We can actually figure out more of those details. But one thing that I need to define before we get back into the software is the word planet. We actually get it from the Greek word planet or planes, which literally means wanderer, from this Greek word, which if anybody speaks Greek, feel free to share with me, how do you pronounce that word? But it means to wander. So if we were roughly to translate this word, planet could mean wandering star. Again, very roughly translated, but to the astronomers from centuries ago that didn't know that these were planets orbiting the same sun that rises and sets, they thought they were stars, but stars that didn't abide by the same kind of actions most of the other stars were. So that's why they called them wanderers. Now, this next part, I want to cover a little bit, and I just want to remind everyone that the enemy is here to steal, kill, and destroy God's original intent for things. Though I know that this can be a little bit of a stretch, just bear with me and just kind of keep this in thought and let the Holy Spirit kind of speak to you about this. So we know there are stars and planets with specific names. Specifically, we have planets that have Greek names. Venus and Jupiter are actually Greek names for specific gods and goddesses that the Greeks believed in. We know that the god of love is named Venus, and the god of all the gods was named Jupiter. If you translate this into the Roman god, it's Zeus, and we know Zeus. He's the god of gods, and he's the most powerful, etc. And with the star, the Roman word for Regulus is actually little king or prince. And with the constellation Leo, we know it translates as the lion. So if we were to show representation of who in the Bible represents love, we would know that's Jesus. He is the embodiment of love and the character of love. Almost every single time, it points exactly to Jesus. And same thing with Jupiter. We know who is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. That's God the Father. We know that he is higher than all. He is all powerful. He has, full control. Nothing happens without him knowing. Same thing with Regulus, little king or prince. Well, if we're talking about the Bethlehem star, we know that the little king or the prince is actually Jesus. So it's very interesting how all these things are pointing right back to the very details we're talking about. And if you'll keep these bookmarked, Venus, Jupiter, Regulus, and Leo. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed Leo. We know that Leo the lion, in the Bible, the lion represents the tribe of Judah. And we'll actually see Revelation chapter 5, verse 5 come into fruition here in a second. So just kind of keep these objects in your mind: Venus, Jupiter, Regulus, and Leo, because we're going to see them again. Now, again, just a reminder, we know that the enemy is here to destroy what was originally intended for God, and that these weren't the actual Hebrew names for them, but because that's what we know them as today, if we translate them back, it's very interesting how it points right back to God and the Bible. And just remember, we're here that God shall give us life and give it abundantly in his fullest. So let's go ahead and dive into some software here. Now, I am going to apologize. I did jump straight into 9/11, the date here in 3 BC. We know this based off of previous events, but for the sake of time, I can't go into those details here. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to change it from today's date, which was actually a few days ago, to the year 3 BC and September 11th. I'm also going to change the time to, it's going to be a little bit before 5:30. And then another interesting detail here is that this date, 9/11, 3 BC, is actually the Hebrew New Year, Rosh Hashanah. So The next thing we're going to do is we're going to track specifically onto Jupiter. We're going to look at Jupiter and we're going to zoom in just a little bit. If you notice, he's actually in Leo, the Mazzaroth sign, or what people know as the zodiac, as Leo the lion. Very interesting detail. But if you zoom in, you can actually see that Jupiter is right next to Regulus. Remember, Jupiter representing God the Father and Regulus representing the little King Jesus. It's very interesting how close those are on a very specific date, 9/11, 3 BC. Now, what I'm going to do next here is I'm actually going to hit play in time. I'm going to click on this little time button here down in the bottom in just 1 second, and half a day is going to represent 1 second. And we're going to see all of the stars and the planets. Well, we're not going to see the stars move because we're going to be staring at one star, but we're going to look at the planets. But I want you to pay attention to Jupiter here. If you notice, it stops, even though we see all the other objects still traveling east to west, but Jupiter is now traveling west to east. That's a very odd thing to do relative to what everything else does. Again, this is also why the previous astronomers called them wanderers. And look, he turned around again and then continued going this way. We can see all of these stars all of these planets are progressing from the east to the west. So very interesting on how this happens. Now, why does it do this? Why does Jupiter go backwards? It's something called retrograde motion. Again, a scientific thing we'll just cover real quickly. It's basically whenever we are orbiting and coming past Jupiter. All right, so I'm going to interject here and input a little video clip in order to make it a little bit easier to understand retrograde motion. What we're going to see here is a truck on our right and a barrier in the background. We're going to watch that barrier relative to the front of this truck. This vehicle is going faster than that truck. So by the time we pass the barrier, the truck hasn't passed it. So it almost makes it look like the truck isn't going to pass it or is getting farther behind, going backwards. This very unique going backwards effect, even though no one changed directions. So very interesting detail whenever you look at that relative to everything, from a sky point of view. Now, there is one more detail that's very interesting about 9/11, 3 BC. So remember we were talking about Mary and Gabriel, and how he's talking to Mary about how she will give birth to a son. An interesting detail is in Revelation chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. It says, "And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and upon her head 12 stars. And she being with child, cried, travailing in birth, and pained to be delivered." So let's go ahead and add 2 more characters to this night sky. Oh, that's one thing that I didn't point out. I apologize. Let's go back 1 slide, and let me show you. We saw Jupiter in Regulus, and it was in Leo. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm waiting for this to go through. So we have Jupiter, Regulus, and we have Leo, right? But if you pay attention, you see Venus and Mercury here. Remember Venus, we can also roughly correlate, simulating Jesus here. And then we have Mercury. So let's see what Mercury is. Mercury, to the Greeks and Romans, was the god known as the god of messages, or like the courier. He is also who we see in like the Red Bull commercials. Red Bull gives you wings. That's who that god was. Again, we know that there wasn't really a god of the messengers, but if we look in the Bible, Gabriel is often related to the angel of messages. He's always there whenever he's giving messages, and he was there giving that message to Mary. So very interesting, the fact that Mercury and Gabriel kind of relate, and how Gabriel can represent Mercury here. And we're going to also add the constellation Virgo. Virgo, translated, is the Virgin. And if you ask any Christian, who's the Virgin in the Bible? Very obviously, people are going to say Mary, the mother of Jesus. So very interesting how these representations keep showing up in these astronomical events related to the Bible. So let's go back. Let's go into that very same date again, 9/11, 3 BC at 5:30. It doesn't have to be 5:30, but I just chose in the morning because this was likely the timing, with how close these are together. But if what you'll see here, you can see Virgo. There's Virgo right next to where we were, Leo, and there's Jupiter and Regulus again, she's clothed in the sun. Sorry, it's hard to see with that play button there. She's clothed in the sun there with the moon under her feet and 12 stars upon her head. Now remember, planets is roughly translated as wandering stars. So if these are planets, we're going to assume they're stars because back then that's what they thought as well. And there's Mercury again, there's Venus again, Michael, and Jesus, and then God the Father. So let's go ahead and hit play here, and let's kind of see how we can add up these 12 here. So we got 1 so far, Mercury. We got Venus 2, 3, 4, 5. We got 6 and 7, Regulus and Jupiter. We got 8. We got 9, 10, 11, 12. So it's very fascinating given the fact that Leo, having done retrograde motion, remember retrograde is whenever we're all orbiting the sun, but we're traveling faster than Jupiter is. So whenever we are passing Jupiter, it looks like, if you look at it comparatively in the background meaning the stars, it looks like Jupiter is going backwards. Again, we know that it's not, because we know that God set them into motion and they're circling the sun, but because we're passing it at that exact time, which we'll see a little bit more of that details here in a second, it actually looks like it goes backwards in time and then goes back again. So that's retrograde motion. But again, very interesting how Virgo and Leo right next to each other, Leo, the tribe of Judah. We also have these planets representing, symbolizing very closely to characters in the Bible. We got God the Father, Jesus, and Gabriel, and then of course Mary, Virgo, the Virgin, and how it lines up specifically with Revelation chapter 12. So all very interesting details. Let's recap that. Let's make sure that we're not going to miss anything here. So we know a very highly possible date of Jesus's coronation, and who was there. We saw Mercury, which, like we said, we're roughly symbolizing Gabriel here. There was Virgo, which is Mary, again, roughly symbolizing, and Venus and Jesus. We know when it happened, 9/11, 3 BC. And then, of course, Revelation chapter 5, which is referencing the tribe of Judah, and Revelation chapter 12, which is clothed in the sun, moon at her feet, and 12 stars upon her head, came about. It manifested. And we can also roughly, like we were talking about with Mercury, Virgo, and Venus, we can see the definitions of astronomical bodies were likely hijacked by the enemy, and they truly actually point to biblical story. So one thing I do want to point out is this date is actually a very significant date to Americans, 9/11. I don't know specifically how this date lines up specifically with our 9/11 of 2001, but I do kind of want to give a little bit more hope behind those numbers. We do know that 9 represents fruit bearing. We know that the gestation period of a woman when she's pregnant is 9 months. We know there's 9 gifts of the Holy Spirit in 1 Corinthians, and we know there's 9 fruits of the Holy Spirit in Galatians. We got fruits and gifts, both 9s. And then moving on to 11, we know that 11 is a symbolization of having great faith, or heroes of the faith, recognizing victorious attributes of people. How does that relate to us today? Veterans Day is on 11/11, November 11th. We know World War I ended on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. We also know Apollo 11 was the first manned mission to the moon. We know Jesus was 33 years old whenever he overcame death, hell, and the grave on the cross. And 33 is 11 times 3. And speaking of 3s, we got 3 BC here. Let's go ahead and throw that in there. We got 3s represents fullness, resurrection, divinity, the perfect completion, the sacrifice. We know this because on the day of the resurrection, it was the 3rd day. Resurrection was on the 3rd day. We also know the writing on the cross was in 3 different languages. There were 3 crosses on Calvary, and Jesus was crucified upon the 3rd hour. And then after crucified, there were 3 hours of darkness on Calvary. There were 3 last words of Jesus: "It is finished." We also know Peter denied Jesus 3 times before the resurrection, and Peter said he loved Jesus 3 times after the resurrection. So there's a lot of 3s whenever it comes to completeness, whenever things are happening. And when you think about the Bethlehem star, that's pretty applicable. 3 is the completion. It's Jesus coming to be the new Adam, so very, very interesting details whenever it comes to the date. But if you notice, I've been calling it the coronation. I haven't been calling it anything else, excuse me. But the reason why is because we know that birth, we know that life begins at conception. So was this the birth or the conception of Jesus? Knowing that life begins at conception, this was likely the event of Luke 1:28, when Gabriel approached Mary about the conception of Jesus. So with that, what we could do is we could fast forward 9 months and see if there's another astronomical event. So knowing 9/11 BC, let's fast forward to June 17th of 2 BC. Remember, in BC, time goes down, because it's counting down to the time of Jesus. And I know that the dates are off a little bit, but the interesting thing is there was actually a feast on the 15th. So it's also very interesting given the fact that this is so close to that feast day. But let's go ahead and hop right back into the software. We're going to jump 9 months to June 17th, 2 BC, like I said, around 8 p.m. local time to Babylon, or Bethlehem, excuse me. You can see Bethlehem is the location here. And I'm going to go ahead and jump to the year 2 BC. We're going to go to... we're going to go to June. We're going to go actually a few days before. We're actually on the 11th, because we're going to hit fast forward and we're going to look at Venus. Remember, Venus representing Jesus and Jupiter, God the Father. We see Venus. It's slowly approaching Jupiter. And here I am. You can see me. I'm jumping forward a half day every click. So what's really happening is I'm jumping forward to get to the closest point in which Jupiter and Venus come together. So we see that Jupiter and Venus are coming together so closely. And you can ignore the other names there, Castillo, Io, Europa. Those are the moons of Jupiter. We won't be addressing those today. But look how close those are. Let's zoom out from telescope view and go into a human eye view. If you saw that so bright in the sky, surely that would be a very significant sign that you would want to relate. You'd think something was happening, especially since it was in the sign Leo. So more interesting things here. But let's go one step further. Let's go and see how the Magi likely saw this. So what we're going to do is now we're going to go to Babylon, where the Magi likely were, about 500
And can I say something there real quick?
Yeah, absolutely. What's that?
Okay, so on the left there, when he says, let's go to Bethlehem, let's go to Babylon. Remember, if we're sitting here in the United States and saw this, it wouldn't look the same. We're not going to see that. He has to put in the software, we're standing in Bethlehem and we're looking up. We're standing in Babylon and we're looking up.
Right.
So that to me was kind of confusing the first time I ever saw any of this. So I don't know if y'all caught that or not, but to me that was kind of confusing. So.
And that's a good thing to point out, because here in a second, what we're going to see is I'm going to put a horizon there so that it's going to look like what the Magi likely saw. But we're going to see these objects go below the horizon, which is really then our rise, because though it's not exactly on the opposite side of the world, what they saw setting was our rising. They're, if I'm not mistaken, 7 hours ahead of us. So you could just take these times and plus 7 hours minus 7 hours and basically see what they would have saw then. But again, I don't want to get too much into the science or the app details just yet, just so that I don't confuse anyone. But again, what we're going to do, I have set my location to Babylon there, and we're going back to the same date. Again, we're going to go a few days before, just to kind of see the progression of them getting closer. So let me go ahead and hit play here again. We're set in Babylon, and we're making sure that we're at the right date and time. So we got 8:52 a.m. All right, so the sun is up and the sign is there. So you're like, wait a minute, but the sun's up. How did they see that? You're right, they didn't. They didn't see it until after sundown. So we're going to watch these two come close together. We're going 3 minutes forward every half second, so 6 minutes every second in time. I don't know if that's clear. Let me go back a little bit there. What that's saying is basically I've set 3 minutes down here, and I'm hitting this fast forward button, and it's going to progress through these days. And the reason I'm doing that is so that, again, we can watch these two progress together. And what just happened was we were on June 15th, but because it's set, I then fast forwarded to June 16th, back at 8:30 in the morning. If you notice the view of the of the sky change orientations. That's just the app trying to make it easier for you to see what likely you would see if you were there at the moment. Um, so that's the don't get confused on why the app's kind of like doing that here. So let's hit play again, June 16th. Again, we're kind of looking at it just from like what you would see standing on the earth, unassisted, no binoculars, no telescope. You got that change in orientation because it's trying to keep everything level. And we see that they're getting closer and closer. Here it is. It's 8 o'clock. It's actually 9 o'clock. Excuse me. You see 8 o'clock here? It's in military time. I apologize. So we got 8 o'clock, 8:10. That means the sun's down and these objects are getting closer and closer. And one thing I didn't point out, and I apologize, is Venus is actually the brightest planet that we get to see. You can actually see it in the mornings and in the evenings, depending on where it is in the year. It only has like a 180-day year. And so like half of the year we see it in the mornings, and then the other half of the year we see it in the evenings. And it's not even half the year, it's more like 2 or 3 months, because there's sometimes where it's on the other side of the sun or it's right in front of the sun, so you'll never see it. But again, we got June 16th here. We're at 8 o'clock at night. Sun has set. The magi are likely thinking, wait a minute, this is a very interesting sign. Is this what we've been waiting for? And so seeing these two objects converge together, we're going to jump to the next day. We got June 17th back at 8 in the morning, and we're going to hit play again, but we're going to zoom in just a little bit so we can watch them converge. They're getting closer and closer and closer. And let's pay attention to the time of day in which we see that they get the closest. You see it's now 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 8 o'clock at night, 8:30. It is so close together on June 17th. And look, so what we're paying attention to is the fact that it's there in the west. So look, you can see the event is right under the play button. I apologize for that, but we're looking west. So if you're in Babylon and you see this event in the west, this was likely the time that the Magi saw Jupiter circling Regulus 9 months before, were alerted by a sign, hey, this must be the star that we've heard so much about. Seeing this Jupiter and Venus converge together 9 months later on June 17th, this was probably the sign that enabled them to start heading east to Jerusalem to learn more from what we now know as Herod. But just for fun, I kind of want to give you guys some homework just to see if you guys want to do this. If you want to see both Jupiter and Venus, you actually can tonight. Of course, given that it's not cloudy. I know here in San Antonio, we've had a lot of clouds every night for the past week or so. But if you look over your head, and again, this is going to be a little bit different depending on obviously time zones and geographical location within a time zone. Roughly around 5:30 p.m. looking west, you should be able to see Venus right after the sun goes down. This might be a little hard just because, like I said, it's very close to the sun there. But Jupiter, right over your head, it should be right over your head around 7:30 p.m. Again, this is kind of dependent on where you are in your time zone. So if I'm right smack dab in the middle, it's 5:30 and 7:30. If I'm more closer to the timeline side, it's either going to be 5 o'clock or 4 o'clock, given on which side of the timeline you are. So do a little bit of homework, have some fun, go outside and look at that. Maybe set an alarm in your phone, see if you can actually see these two objects.
So you're saying it's 5:30 and 7:30 Central Time Zone.
No, every time zone. That's what I'm saying. It's going to be a little bit different. So in your time zone, at your 5:30, you should be able to see Venus. I say should, only because there is going to be a possibility that you won't be able to, either because of weather or because of timing. So like if you're at the farthest eastern side of Maine, it's going to be 5 o'clock and likely the sun is still up. But if you're far, I think the central time zone is the biggest. If you're in this farther western side of your time zone, it's probably going to be more close to 6 o'clock and the sun's probably gone down. You should still have a little bit of last light, but you should still be able to see Venus then. Again, that one's going to be the hardest one to actually see because it's so close to sundown. There might still be daylight shining, so it might be a little bit confusing. But Jupiter, you should most definitely be able to see, obviously weather permitting, right over your head between 7 and 8. Let me just say 7 and 8 because it's not going to be exactly perfect 7:30 depending on where you are in your time zone. So
Thank you.
you're welcome. All right, so observing these two signs, we can see that this solves the problem that we had earlier. We know how does a star stop now because of retrograde motion. We saw that Jupiter did a circling motion. It looked like it went forward and then it stopped and then it turned back around and then it stopped again and it came back forward again. So we know that that solves that problem. But how does a sign appear twice like no other sign before? Let's see if this retrograde motion also answers that second stop in the night sky after the Magi has now arrived to talk to Herod, know about Bethlehem, and that they need to head south, or I'm sorry, arrived in Jerusalem to talk to Herod and need to know that they need to head south to Bethlehem to find Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. So we're going to look at the retrograde motion again. But what we're going to do first, before we begin, we're going to start at 617 2 BC, which is around the time of Jesus's birth. I'm not saying it's confidently that, but this is a likely event of when Jesus was born. We got 617 2 BC. And we're going to fast forward to the end of the year. I know you can already see the date here, which I'm sure we're already very familiar with. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit play. Again, also pay attention to the signs we see here. We got Mercury again, we got Regulus, and we're focused on Jupiter. So if you notice, you can even see retrograde motion right there with Venus. Watch Venus. You see it's coming back around. It's going backwards, and it stops, and it comes back again. But we're going to watch Jupiter now. He goes into Virgo, and he stops. See, we're in January 1st, 1 BC. Let's go backwards just a little bit and watch that again. So we're back in November, going forward again, November, December, January, February. You see it turned around. That's retrograde motion. We've passed Jupiter and made it look like the Jupiter was going backwards. But I want to point out, look, it's December 25th in which Jupiter looks like it has stopped in Virgo. Very interesting. Let's look at it again, but closer. And I'm going to put a little bit of science from the app into the view here so that we can see specifically some details. So what I've put in here is actually the planetary orbit path in which Jupiter is going to go, but with timestamps. So we can see August 3rd, August 12th, January 27th. These are the times in which Jupiter is going to arrive at that spot. So we see July, August, going to go into September here, and pay attention to when Jupiter stops. See what timing we're going to see right here. We got November slowing down. Oh, and there it looks like it stopped. Here we are, December 25th. Isn't that fascinating? It stops on December 25th in Virgo. Very interesting details. Virgo, Mary, Jupiter, God the Father. Very interesting details in which how it stops using retrograde motion. So now that we have all this information, I know that I've thrown a bunch at you, so let me try and clean it up just a little bit. Let's put it into a timeline. So what the Magi likely saw was Jupiter retrograding around Regulus on 9/11 of 3 BC. We could probably correlate that to Gabriel approaching Mary at this around the same time, if not the same dates specifically. This probably alerted the Magi, hey, there was a sign in the sky. What does that mean? This could have been a time period in which they started learning a little bit more, which the Magi, in a different topic, were descendants of some individuals, dare I say, Daniel, after he stayed in Babylon. But that's, again, could be debated, and especially for a different presentation. But with that being said, whenever the Magi, they were probably on alert now. They're like, hey, something happened. We should be preparing. And then they saw the event of Jupiter and Venus converging together in the evenings of 617 2 BC. This was likely whenever they started heading west to Jerusalem to meet up with Herod. And then after communicating with Herod, after arriving, and Babylon is believed to be about 50 miles south of what is modern day Baghdad. That's about 500 miles. If you were to walk that specifically, it would probably take you about a week, given today's time science and stuff and health and how healthy people are. So if you were with an entourage and bringing people, you could probably assume that it takes, a couple of weeks. Which makes sense on why they were able to get there and also to Jesus just in time for the second sign in the sky of Jupiter retrograding in Virgo and stopping south of them over Bethlehem. So we got all of our events here in a timeline, starting at 911, 3 BC, 617, 2 BC, all the way to 1225, 2 BC. So this is believed, again, this is one way that it is believed in which the timeline of Jesus's birth story is timelined out. Now, I know we are getting close to our hour time, so I am going to conclude there and ask if anybody has any questions.
Could you do that again?
You want me to start over or start at the beginning?
I mean, there's probably about 9 hours there that I'll have to go back.
And I do apologize. A lot of this was very compressed. I felt so bad sometimes just like getting information and then compressing it. But I was trying to fit all of this into an hour, you know?
Well, you did a good job.
Thank you.
It's going to take 9 hours for me to go through it again. But I'll tell you something, it's really fascinating how the enemy has hijacked the names and given a rebranding. And that alone was golden, Dylan. Really, that was wonderful.
You know, I'm so glad you brought that up, and because that's actually one of the other things that I have searched out myself with Denise. I want to also point out Denise is part of this journey too. I know she doesn't give herself enough credit at all, but she's also helped me with this presentation too, because when you're science-based and like you just know science stuff and then you just start spitting out information, she's like, whoa, wait, stars don't move. You know, like she'll say stuff and I'm like, oh, I gotta slow down a little bit. I gotta make sure I'm not going too fast. But I'm glad you brought out the hijacking part, because something else that Denise and I have discovered is each of the 12 major signs are actually signs relating to Jesus himself. The first 4 is Jesus's first coming. Second 4 is the church age. First coming. I don't know if I said second coming. And then the last 4 is the Jesus's second coming. And each one actually has a specific name. So like there's three constellations that help tell the story of Virgo the Virgin, and it's Coma, Centaurus, Boötes, and they each have a biblical name: the desired son, the despised sin offering, he who cometh. You know, so it's very interesting how the enemy has absolutely stolen this away from us, and there is way more in the Bible and in the stars together that could be, you know, mined out and, you know, build our faith.
Oh, it's fantastic. Just this graphic alone is gold. It's worth, it's like a diamond, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, just to have that down, to be able to print that off and to keep that, and the scriptures that you gave out of Job, you know, like this is our knowledge has, unless you're really immersed in astronomy and know those words and be, it's like a double pathway. It's like a double thing of scriptural knowledge and knowledge of astronomy. Like that's you know, that's a rare combination, in my opinion.
Definitely. Oh yes, I agree.
You know, so
well,
I guess what I'm asking
for is like sorry, go ahead, Ed.
No, I was going to say, it would be nice to have the 12 Maseroths, that screenshot, be able to have a copy of that to print off for my own sake, for my own use, because I can see myself going into that again and again to look at various scriptures.
Yeah, definitely. And like I said, this is actually something that I would love to teach on more. Unfortunately, it's going to be hard to fit all the 12 Maseroth into 1 hour thing. So we're actually toying with the idea of maybe keeping this a class that goes on and starting in the new year, starting at the beginning, starting with Virgo and going all the way through Leo the Lion, and seeing all that play out, especially relating to the Bible. But
the graphics that you Dylan, is fantastic. Really, very so professionally presented. Wonderful. Thank you for inviting me.
You're very welcome.
Excellent, Dylan. You're a great presenter.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Does anybody else have any questions? Anything else I could maybe reiterate or any confusion? All right. Well, if you do, feel free to.
Let me, Dylan, Susan put in the chat, I've been reading The Fifth Seal by, just a minute, the chat moved. Brody and Brock Thone, and the biblical names of the stars converging on Bethlehem are part of the discussion of the shepherds, Joseph and Mary. You might find it interesting to read. And then we've been putting this together, and he's ran through it a couple of times, and tears still come to my eyes when you see the intentionality of God in that September date and that June date, and then the December date. God is so intentional, and he's so into the details. He is a God of order, and there is a reason and a purpose for everything. Just one of the things, especially since they talk about trumpets a lot at Christmas time, there's like 3 signs of trumpets in the sky. And I didn't know that there's also 3 different types of trumpet blast in the Bible until I learned this about the trumpets in the sky. I mean, it just so ties together, and God is in the details. I just cannot tell y'all enough about how fascinating this is.
Amen. There's so many, just like Dylan said in the beginning, that God, he wants us to seek it out. He wants us to find it out. Those secrets are there for us to learn.
Yeah.
There's so much in there that proves everything that God has been doing. It's all been intentional, like you said, Denise.
Absolutely. Now there is something I wanted to share. I did create a little page of just the links to Rick Larson's documentary, where I got most of my information from. I basically did a lot of watching, studying of my own, and then pasting into here. And I'd like to honor him too, because like I said, a lot of this information is from him. So in this link that I'm posting in the chat, you can go there and you can actually see a lot of the Bethlehem Star documentary by Rick Larson links both to Amazon, to his website, and even just to watch it for free. It is on YouTube for free, which I so appreciate. But if I'm actually not mistaken, Denise and I have a copy of the 3 or 4 copies of the Bethlehem Star around this house. I have seen all of them, and actually recently. But on there, I do also want to throw out there is a donation option. It is not mandatory. It's not obligated. Just if you feel led to donate, by all means. I know that was a request, so I just wanted to put that in there for those that requested it. But one thing that I also wanted to share is the software that I was using is called Sky Safari, and it does look like this. There are newer versions, so if you see one that's different than this picture here, don't be too alarmed or confused. Oh, and these are on the iPhone. I'm not certain of if they're on the Android Google Play Store or not. I would be very surprised if they weren't. But I also wanted to suggest a few. First and foremost, the Sky Safari one. Like I said, there's going to be different versions. It's my most favorite one because just the time scrolling. There's events where it alerts you, like, hey, Jupiter and Venus are converging, or it tells me the phases of the moon, which I like to keep up with. But the unfortunate thing, obviously, is it costs you money, somewhere between $3 to about $15. I think there's actually a $35 one, which I did get in the past, and it connects like to your telescope, and then that way, like, you just be like, point there, and then it goes. But there's a little bit of a learning curve. I know I was going super fast in those screen recordings. But after a while, it's very fun and it's very useful. But if you want a more of a beginner one, my next suggestion would be Night Sky. Although it's not easy to scroll back in time, you should still be able to. I know some of these apps actually stop you after a certain date, which some of these other ones you see up here that aren't listed down here, that's why I didn't list them. They stop you after like 1500 BC. AD, or like they stop you at 180, so you can't even go back 2 more years or 3 more years to see these signs that I just showed you. And then there was just one that it just was not easy to use, so please don't use Stellarium. it was so confusing. It had so many ads. It was a little buggy, and it was just a lot of information at one time. So if y'all do get any apps, I do suggest these three first. If you don't want to pay anything, if you're willing to pay $3, this one is definitely worth it. Just if you have any questions, feel free to let me know, because I know that there's a learning curve with it. But
One-time cost, right, Dylan?
one-time cost, yes, it's not monthly. Although a lot of these do have a subscription. In fact, some of these you have to pay a subscription in order to get the calendar event or something like that. But they still give you some events for free. Like this one gives you event notifications of when things are rising, when things are happening.